Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by David Skilling, who is Director at economic advisory firm Landfall Strategy. Welcome, David, again to interest.co.nz. Good to see you. Now, you're obviously based in the Netherlands these days. I thought it might be interesting just to kick off and talk a little bit about how life is there now. I did notice in some highlights of a Dutch football game recently, there was a decent sized crowd there. So is life sort of getting back to something resembling normal now?
Yeah, and it has been for quite some time. And for better or for worse, you walk down the street, you go into supermarkets, and you would be hard pressed to know that there is a pandemic. You see some people wearing masks, including ourselves, but the Dutch don't much like masks. Vaccination rates are kind of okay, in the 60s, almost 70%. But cases are still running at about 2,500 a day, which you adjust for New Zealand size, 600-700 a day. It was up at about 3-4 times that level a few months back, and it's been stable at about that for the last couple of months or so. So it's, the cases are not great. Deaths about 30 or 40 a week, which would be horrific to a New Zealand audience. But people have kind of made the trade-off, and the government has also made the trade-off that actually we're going to try and get things back to normal. That was kind of the quid pro quo. Vaccination rates get to a certain level and life will begin to open up. So the Formula One was on last week with huge crowds. Things are back to normal. And across Europe more broadly, you see a pretty similar profile. Vaccination rates across the EU just north of 70%, double vaccinated. The summer holiday season was pretty strong. So Greece, for example, tourism was running at over 90% of 2019 levels. A lot of people, not going outside Europe because it's still a bit difficult to travel outside Europe, but within Europe, a lot of people traveling, vaccine passports working pretty well. People are wearing masks, there is social distancing, but life is getting recognizably the same as it was pre-COVID with social distancing and the like. There's a bit of concern though, in terms of the Israeli experience. Even once you got double shots, there's a sense that we'll have to have booster shots and the like. So there's certainly a sense that this has got a while to run. But in general, certainly compared to New Zealand, life looks a lot more normal than it did even 3-4 months ago.
Yeah, obviously you'll be up to date with New Zealand. A month ago, life here was very normal, but then we've obviously had a Delta outbreak, and certainly here in Auckland, we're in a strict lockdown at the moment. We were talking prior to this lockdown about how we were going to start opening to the world. You'll be aware that the government came out with a sort of loose strategy with countries with different risk profiles, and they were going to have a pilot of business people traveling and isolating at home, etc. That's obviously all on hold while we battle this outbreak. Just interested in, you obviously specifically, you look at some other relatively small developed economies around the world. Singapore's a country you've got a lot of knowledge about, you've lived there. Is that one where there are some lessons maybe for New Zealand as we move forward from where we currently are?
Yeah, I think so. Singapore took a reasonably similar approach to New Zealand in terms of the early stages of COVID, in terms of trying to get cases as close to zero as possible. Their numbers are a little bit worse for New Zealand, but they did a pretty good job. Social distancing, they closed the borders, mask wearing, excuse me, and they did a pretty good job. There were some outbreaks among foreign workers, dormitories and the like, but in terms of, for the most part, they did a good job. But it did come at an economic cost. They're a trading hub, tourism, migration, big drivers of their economy as well. But they were able to open up. They were quite quick to move on vaccinations, and they've got one of the highest vaccination rates now, but they're still having to impose a measure of restrictions which have just been tightened over the last little while. And so they're kind of getting to a stage where the vast majority of the population are vaccinated. There is still a bit of community spread within the country, although not nearly the numbers that they saw last year. And so they're now trying to get into this balancing act, if you like, of how do we sensibly reopen, get jobs back, get the economy moving in a way that doesn't jeopardize the public health outcomes as well. So, they have various travel windows that are open, and they are actively thinking about how do you loosen quarantine arrangements, what's the timeline for reopening the economy. And so they're being very pragmatic, very kind of balanced about it, if you like, in terms of understanding that there are trade-offs, but you can't kind of keep the economy closed indefinitely. And so they're kind of edging their way forward, signalling that they are going to be opening up over the next several months. They're going to do that in an incremental way. They're going to tighten up if they need to, but in general, they've got a pretty clear direction of travel. And I think, over the next sort of 2-3 months, you will see Singapore begin to open up quite markedly. They are very aware that there is going to be some risks associated with that, which they will manage as those risks manifest. But I think they are in a position where, because the vaccination rates are so high, and they've got a public health system that is very functional, and the death rates remain very low, there's a sense actually they are in a position to move. New Zealand clearly is a way away from that in terms of the current level of vaccinations, although obviously it's proceeding quite quickly now, but it's still, in terms of the levels of vaccinations, quite a way south of where Singapore is. So I think that there is a lot to learn from Singapore as we kind of figure out what to do over the next few months in terms of, not really replicating what they did, but learning from their experience. What can you do? How do you do it? I think the biggest difference I would note between Singapore and New Zealand is really one of mindset as much as anything. I mean, Singapore did go for something kind of approaching elimination in the early stages of COVID last year, although they didn't kind of formally call it that, but kind of that was essentially what they were trying to do, keep the numbers as close to zero as possible. But New Zealand has gone, obviously very, very hard on kind of elimination is explicitly the strategy. Zero is the number that we are aiming for. And that, as far as I can tell, sitting on the other side of the world, but monitoring the debate quite closely, seems to command very strong public support. So there's quite a high level of risk aversion in the New Zealand debate, which means that there's a high salience, if you like, any kind of case that gets in across the borders, that's a real cause for concern. So I think Singapore is prepared to make a more, to kind of trade things off, I suppose, and understanding that there are going to be some economic and public health trade-offs to be made. That, to me, is a big issue for New Zealand. And I think there are things to learn from Singapore in terms of logistics, for techniques, for what the strategy looks like. There's also some things to learn from Singapore in terms of how do you begin to adjust from COVID being a global pandemic, something that's now kind of endemic, is going to be with us for some time. We will never completely kill it, at least not for the foreseeable future. We have to learn to live with it. And to me, that's the bigger learning, I think, from Singapore and from some others, is how do you kind of adjust your mindsets and your approach to something that's endemic. So that to me is the big thing to be watching for.
Yeah, look, that's very interesting. In Singapore, my understanding is their vaccination rates are north of 80% of certainly the adult population. That's been an interesting topic in New Zealand. Obviously, you'll be aware that our vaccination rates over the last month have really started to soar, obviously off a low base compared to some other countries. Certainly, you can argue was it overly bureaucratic and perhaps a bit of a lack of urgency in the early days here, but certainly now it's moving very quickly. There has been talk about what sort of rate we should try and get to. The government hasn't committed to a specific rate yet. It was quite interesting a little while ago. Scott Morrison in Australia was talking about 70%. A lot of epidemiologists said, well, that's not enough. Singapore north of 80. Denmark's another country that's north of 80% that we're hearing quite a lot about now. I mean, if New Zealand does get somewhere like that, how normal could our lives be, do you think?
Well, normal-ish, but not 2019 normal, right? And I can sympathise it to an extent with the government being a little bit equivocal on specifying, 80% or 75%, because you just don't know exactly what that number is. And I think even if you get vaccination rates of 80, 90%, which is where Singapore, Denmark, and the like are getting to, you are going to have Delta spreading in the community. You will have cases, you'll have hospitalizations, you'll have deaths. So that's there is no magic number of vaccinations that will kind of satisfy the elimination criteria. But if you look at a country like Denmark, which earlier this week basically relieved all of the existing restrictions, so they're in a sense going back to sort of life as normal, although there will be, I'm sure, a measure of kind of caution among the population, but all the formal restrictions are being lifted. They're basically saying, look, it is endemic. We are going to have to adjust and to live with it. But I think the reality for New Zealand is there is no magic vaccination rate that we can then relax and things will go back to normal. And Israel is the kind of a classic example of this. I mean, Israel, as you all know, led the world in terms of very high vaccination rates, and then kind of began to normalize, and then discovered actually cases were rocketing, not so much deaths and hospitalization, but certainly the number of cases. And so they had to clamp down again. And just over the last week or so, they began a systematic program of third shots. And we're talking now about getting supplies in so they can give fourth shots to people as required. So there's a realization, I think, that normal is a relative term. It's certainly going to be more normal than 2020 and 21 have been so far. There are ways of kind of managing the extremes, managing the pressure on hospitals, for example. Vaccinations, although imperfect, are still doing a very, very good job in terms of controlling that pressure. And so, be it Denmark, be it Sweden, be it much of Northern Europe, to be honest, be it Israel or Singapore, vaccines do offer the prospect of allowing life to return to normal. The unfortunate reality is that normal is not going to be zero cases or zero deaths. And so there, how you trade those things off, every country is going to approach that slightly differently. But I think from a New Zealand policy perspective and from a communications perspective, beginning to understand that is our new reality. But we are going to have to accept that there are some trade-offs. Zero is not a sustainable number kind of indefinitely. That, I think, is the tricky thing. The tricky thing to do. And in a sense, because New Zealand has been so successful in keeping the cases and the deaths so low compared to other countries, and as far as I can tell, the domestic sort of population, the voting base, also regard it as a huge success. In a sense, that makes it a bit more difficult to begin to depart from that policy setting, which is quite a binary one. We're going for zero. Moving to a more grey sort of set of scenarios, is a tricky thing to do, both as a matter of sort of policy, but also as a matter of politics. So I think this is COVID is always kind of better seen as a marathon rather than a sprint. New Zealand did extraordinarily well through the early stages of COVID in terms of keeping cases, deaths down, being able to reopen the economy. But the reality is there is no kind of finishing line for COVID. In Israel, I mentioned, it gives us an indication of that. It's going to keep rolling for probably for years to come. And so I think the trick is, just because something worked incredibly well in the early days, a huge amount of uncertainty, a huge amount of costs, economic public health costs that New Zealand managed very well, doesn't mean that we can keep on rolling that strategy out kind of indefinitely. At some point, we do need to transition to something else. And I think that's where looking at the other countries, the international experience, Singapore, Denmark, Sweden, Israel, and the like, is quite instructive. It gives us a sense of, what are the trade-offs, what are the choices open to us, and what has worked well and not well. But I don't think that we can continue to run the elimination strategy forward indefinitely. And I mean, my sense is that's now becoming an increasingly consensus view. The challenge is kind of, what does that actually look like specifically? And that's going to be quite a difficult conversation to have.
Yes, I think we're going to have some interesting discussions around that in coming weeks and months here. One thing, I guess from a global perspective, when we spoke in April last year, one point you made was that there was a lack of global coordination in fighting the pandemic. Has that really changed this year? And I guess when you talk about there not being a finish line, I think an important point a lot of people are making is that in a lot of countries that have low vaccination rates or even reasonably high ones, new variants are going to continue to emerge from a mutating virus. So this lack of global coordination, is that going to remain a problem?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the WHO, the various coalitions that have been pulled together to try and distribute vaccines to the developing world, they have underperformed, compared to commitments made, the expectations put on them, in some cases unrealistically, but even when commitments have been made around vaccines, they just keep on coming under that. And if you look at the EU, has received a lot of criticism for its vaccination program. It's actually done a pretty good job in terms of at least allowing vaccines manufactured in the EU to be exported. The US hasn't. It's got vaccines kind of expiring past their due date, unwilling to export even to Latin America. So I think the reality, unfortunate reality, is that in situations like this, even though the pandemic is the definition of a global event, all politics is local. and politicians, be it of national governments or of regional governments like the EU, are driven by kind of domestic or regional political incentives. It's unfortunate. It would be nice if that weren't the case, but I think it is the case. And I don't see that changing. I mean, the WHO is, encouraging, countries very strongly, developing countries, not to administer or to approve third shots, booster shots, because I feel like there's just so much demand elsewhere. But for the most part, that kind of recommendation is being ignored. So the short answer is I'm not expecting to see kind of a global response from the G20, WHO, UN. It is unfortunately everyone for themselves. The consequence of that is, as you said in your remarks, was that suggests that there are going to be ongoing spread in many parts of the developing world. That raises the likelihood, of course, of further mutations, which will ultimately affect all of us. So, and it also, from a more purely economic or commercial perspective, means that if you look at many developing countries that are central to global supply chains, Southeast Asia being one obvious one, where from Malaysia to Vietnam to Indonesia and the Philippines, are all really struggling with COVID. You're going to have parts of the global economy that just aren't functioning fully because of the huge pressure, be it lockdowns, people being sick, and the like. So even if you take it from a narrow economic perspective, it's bad news. And certainly from a broader social and health perspective, it's awful news. But I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Now, obviously, we also spoke last year about tourism and migration, which had been big drivers of the New Zealand economy prior to COVID hitting. Obviously, that has changed significantly since COVID came along. I'm just wondering, I mean, realistically, do they ever get back to where they were? What future do you see for tourism and migration, certainly in a New Zealand context?
Yes, I think a different future. And I think the difference between the COVID shock and, say, a shock like the global financial crisis a decade or so ago, apart from the fact that the financial crisis was almost entirely a financial and economic crisis, the COVID shock has gone on for 18 months and counting. Border restrictions, domestic lockdowns, and as we've been discussing, quite a way still to go. Whereas the global financial crisis was a much shorter, sharper shock. It didn't interfere with kind of day-to-day life to nearly the same extent. And so normally mean reversion is a pretty good rule of thumb. Something happens, but then you kind of get snapped back pretty quickly. I think an 18-month and counting shock gives enough time for preferences and for behaviours to change. So take tourism and migration one by one. While on tourism, all of the forecasts from airlines, from international organisations suggest at a minimum, it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years for international tourism, international passenger movements to get back to where they were in 2019 levels. And if you decompose that even further, it's the long haul travel, leisure travel bit of it, that's likely to take even longer to bounce back. So I mentioned earlier, within Europe, the northern summer travel has actually been pretty solid. Within the US, it's actually been pretty solid. Within China, up until their recent lockdowns, also pretty solid. So people are quite happy to jump on planes and go kind of 2-3 hours where they don't have to worry so much about lockdowns or the like. But in terms of traveling, sort of across the world, and for most people getting to New Zealand is a long haul sort of adventure, that is going to take a while longer to come back. I think international travel is going to become a lot more regional in nature. I also think the economics of tourism into New Zealand is going to change. New Zealand had enormous growth of pretty low cost seat capacity in the several years before COVID, which is one reason our tourism numbers went up so strongly. I think the economics of the aviation industry in terms of ability to put on those low cost seats is going to change. So, I think the tourism, even when borders reopen, I think there's going to be changes in the economics of the aviation industry. I think people's preferences, their level of risk aversion are going to be quite high for some time to come. Public health concerns, do I really want to be sitting in a plane for 12 hours to get to, in this case, New Zealand? And also I think the other thing that has changed is growing recognition of the emissions profile of long-haul international travel. Now, that's, in a sense, independent of COVID. It was happening pre-COVID, but I think there's more of an understanding now that, there is an emissions-intensive aspect of long-haul travel, and New Zealand clearly is exposed to that. So, I think it's going to be a long climb back for for sort of the long haul part of our international travel profile, which obviously includes Asia, but particularly Europe and the US. So, I think this summer for New Zealand is going to be, well, it probably won't happen. I think it's going to be a lot like last summer was, but even once we kind of reopen our borders, I don't think we should expect a rapid snapback. Migration, I think similarly, the difference here is that there's a much larger policy component to it, right? So the fact that the Productivity Commission has been tasked with doing a report on migration, the mood seems to have changed. Turns out we can actually get by without the flow of migrants that we were receiving. It was a huge driver of our economy, huge driver of labour force growth up until COVID, and there's been a hard stop, but the economy has continued to function, not perfectly, and there are still shortages, but it's functional. So I think there's now space to think about how do we set migration policy, and my sense is the government, along with other governments around the world, including Singapore, are going to be more discriminating, shall we say, in terms of the quantum and the type of migration. So I wouldn't expect that we will see anything close to the kind of the migration inflows that we were seeing before COVID. That probably means that labour markets are going to remain tight, which is probably good for wages. It's good for domestic employment. It probably means more investment in capital and technology, more investment in the workforce. So I actually think it's not a bad thing, but in the short term, there is going to be a bit of a drag in terms of just reduced or constrained growth in the labour force.
Well, look, David, that's great. I appreciate your time. That's David Skilling, Director at Economic Advisory Firm Landfall Strategy, speaking to us from the Netherlands. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.